You're watching Deprogrammed. As you know by now, this is the New Culture Forum show, committed to fighting back against the forces of ideological conformity, particularly among the young. My name is Harrison Pitt. I'm a senior editor at the European Conservative, and I'm delighted to be joined today, as ever, by Connor Tomlinson, the host of Tomlinson Talks at thelotuseaters.com, and our special guest this week, Nina Power, writer, philosopher, former senior editor at Compact until her recent exit, of which more recently. Now, Nina, thank you very much for coming on. We will get to the specifics of your case in due course, but for the time being, we're seeing the British state under Sir Keir Starmer escalate its war on freedom of thought and speech. Do you think that the brazenness on his part is deliberate and intended in some way, or it's the result of some kind of political miscalculation of which he's quietly regretting?
I think if we look at it in terms of the various groups involved, so the very quick mobilisation of the SWP and various leftist groups and Antifa, who are basically like the kind of shock troops of the regime, very quickly mobilising the media, like marching in lockstep with the government position, which is that any opposition to anything that's happened, whether it's the murders, whether it's various violent events, whether it's immigration in general, or any other economic question, which is extremely pressing. I mean, a lot of the riots, so-called riots, are happening in places that are very economically deprived as well, and have been for a very long time. I think we can see something like a psyop. I mean, maybe we shouldn't use this word, but there's definitely a kind of program going on. I think it is strategic. I think they have made a decision. I think the media have been told to say, oh, look, there's been this massive protest against the so-called far right. I mean, I think you can always tell at the moment when words like, the phrases like far right are being used constantly. No one is ever just in the centre or centre right or right wing. Everyone who in any way criticises or even says, can we have a conversation, or says, I think the people asking questions about immigration should be heard, for example, which would be the kind of liberal, open-minded, dialogic position, everyone is far right, right? There seems to be nothing in between. And I think it's this crushing of the centre is a kind of act of power. It's an act of dominance by the new government, working with all of these other forces, including NGOs, groups like Hope Not Hate, and other very sinister organisations.
It's interesting though, because how do they hope to be rewarded by this? Because I mean, the Tony. I would imagine that the Tony Blair strategy to what we've seen would have been to make sure that the frog is being boiled at as continual and moderate a pace as possible, so that the frog doesn't notice. Whereas Keir Starmer has been constantly pouring petrol on the fire, and certainly now, after having done that, a certain amount of managed spontaneity needs to come in. You get these potential psyops and all that sort of thing. But his initial statement, do you think he miscalculated there? Because after all, these riots and these protests, and obviously there is a mixture of the two going on. Many of them peaceful, many of them, of course, are not. We've seen that on our Twitter feeds. But these are happening in Labour heartlands, and Keir Starmer can't hope to be rewarded for this electorally come 2029.
I don't think it matters. I think probably the Uniparty exists now forever anyway, and all opposition is basically being crushed. I mean, if you think back to 2011, remember Keir Starmer was head of DPP. He oversaw, by the way, the student persecutions and the riot persecutions, so he has great practice. In 2011, we had 24/7 courts, just as we're seeing now. We're seeing the very rapid imprisonment of rioters. And this is very much pour un courage à les autres, right? Like, you will go to prison. Like, remember in the riots in 2011, we had people going to prison for joke Facebook events, calling for, as a joke, a riot in their hometown where there was no riot happening, right? People like that were put in prison. People were put in prison for stealing a bottle of water. And I think what we're seeing is the very rapid imprisonment of people, and that blurring of the boundary between action in the street or action in groups and action online. They're eliminating the distinction between public and semi-private. And I'm sure we will see many more people go to prison, be charged very quickly. So I think it's an act of dominance. I don't think he miscalculated. I think he's very well aware of the resources of the state and the fact that all institutions are pretty much captured by exactly the same logic. So that even someone like me, who's an old school left liberal, is now a neo-Nazi, because I think that we should listen to people who disagree with one another and come to peaceful resolution where possible. But we should also pay attention to people who are quite rightly upset about things like murder, about things like mass immigration, about things like the economic deprivation of their towns and cities, which is what we've seen for years, and it's only getting worse.
I make you right, actually. I do think this is the total state moving in concert, because if you notice, the ability for them to mobilize against protesters and rioters, as we've reiterated on the show, don't go to one of these riots because you might be swept up in it, even if you are incensed about the murder of these girls or mass immigration, as we all are around here. Don't give the state an excuse. But if they're so rapid to charge over 100 people, they've made over 400 arrests now, but they haven't charged this Axel character yet, the second generation migrant who did it. If they really wanted to bring a swift resolution to this whole thing, they would do so. And so they're making a deliberate decision not to do that. They're prioritizing the rioters. And on the fact that this might be some kind of psyop or controlled spontaneity exercise, I do think Keir Starmer is a much less savvy political actor than someone like Tony Blair is. This is why he wasn't very flexible when responding to being heckled when he laid that wreath. He didn't give a press conference to show solidarity with the people of Southport after the girls were murdered, only to demonise the far right, which I assume means all of us and anyone else concerned about his mismanagement of economic situations and immigration, and his consensus's mismanagement of doing so over the last 30 years. But we know from Laura Dodsworth's book that the Home Office do this all the time. They roll out Don't Look Back in Anger after the Manchester Arena bombing. They roll out a woman in a hijab on the front page of The Sun after a 2014 terror attack. So it's not surprising that the eye of the storm is closing around free speech in this way in order to control the narrative in such a fashion.
Yeah, I mean, I think just we also have to be kind of precise. And, I say this to myself as well, like not to get kind of too paranoid, not to get too kind of hysterical. But I do think we are looking at massive clampdowns on free speech across the board for anyone who doesn't conform exactly to the regime narrative, which is completely dominant in all the institutions. We had hoped that cancel culture and all of this stuff was coming to an end. I think that was optimistic. Just to be precise on the charges, I mean, for the boy charged with the murder of the 3 girls and the attempted murder on others, this will obviously be a Crown Court trial. So whereas the rioters are generally being processed through magistrates' courts, and if they enter a guilty plea, it's much faster. But to go back to the speed point, they are doing it quickly to make a point, right? To basically say, this will happen to you if you say anything on social media or if you go and protest. And also, it's also to induce this confusion. So you don't know what you can and can't say. Do you see what I mean?
It's also noticeable not only whom they're imprisoning quickly, but who they're actually releasing quite quickly as well.
Right.
I mean, we've seen this case. I forget the convict's name, but he entered a manslaughter plea after this 14-year-old white British boy was murdered to death. Well, I think some of them went down for murder, so some others went down for manslaughter. This was only a matter of 6 months ago, and these gentlemen, well, one of them at least, is being released early, whereas we just saw someone, admittedly a criminal, someone who shouldn't have done this, who hit a police officer in the face, being sent down for 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's very obvious that Starmer and the police chiefs do not like the idea. They don't like being called two-tier, right? But I think it's manifestly clear if we look at the kind of Gaza protests, and I defend the right to protest. I used to work for an organisation called precisely Defend the Right to Protest, but it has to be for everyone, and it has to be equal, and it has to be liberal, and it has to be tolerance for intolerance as well, actually. I mean, people misquote that Popper thing constantly because they're idiots, but actually that hasn't been happening, right? We've seen Jewish people being harassed by people protesting on the Palestine protests, right, without kind of any comeback on that. So it's very, very obvious that different groups are being treated differently. We saw this also with women protesting for their rights, and the fact that Antifa and people in balaclavas were allowed to kind of harass them, shout at them, intimidate them, threaten them, and physically assault them in some cases. So it's very obvious when you look at these different groups, the police are treating people very differently. They've been arresting people for tweets. For years now, women have been arrested or had their thought checked by police officers coming to the door when they've tweeted something like, men can't become women. Something that everybody knew, everybody still knows, they're just pretending not to. But everybody thought and acted with this knowledge and this worldview for hundreds of thousands of, if not thousands of years. And now suddenly the police come round. So we know that this is happening.
I think I would argue as well that we've seen signs recently of Britain genuinely slipping, and I say this without hyperbole, into a kind of quasi-police state. Because, I mean, the two main conditions which qualify a state to be described as a police state, I would wager, is that the police feel no responsibility to be attended to the law in the exercise of their powers. That would be the first one. I suppose the second one would be that the police are generally above criticism and above reproach. And we saw the Director of Public Prosecutions yesterday invoking a very suspicious and seemingly self-serving reading of the certain iterations of the Public Order Act, saying that people who were sharing footage on Twitter and on other places of rioting, criminal rioting that were taking place, are themselves participating in that rioting in some sense, and they are therefore criminally liable in the same way that obviously you would be criminally liable if you're. There are certain forms of sharing criminal behavior which necessarily participate in it. So if you're sharing libel, if you're sharing child pornography, you are necessarily participating in its circulation at the same time, even if you didn't produce it yourself. So there are obviously cases like that. But that would mean that every single person who's ever put up a video of 9/11 on YouTube, or every single person who's put up a video of machete fights going on in the South End would be answerable to the law. That's a very self-serving reading of the law. So clearly that would fit the definition of police state, which says that they're not very attentive to the law and the exercise of their powers. And we also saw Sir Mark Rowley yesterday hint, semi-suggesting that in actual fact, people who describe the police as engaging in two-tier policing could themselves be guilty of legitimizing violence against the police. And that, what is that if not a Mickey Mouse way of saying that these people would themselves be guilty of incitement of violence? I've called the police I've accused the police of two-tier policing. I suspect you have. I know Connor has. Does that mean that we're answerable to that? And that would put the police above reproach, which is the second element of being a police state. So I don't think it's hyperbole to say that at this point.
No, I don't disagree. And I think we've seen the expansion of hate speech legislation. I mean, sometimes it gets tempered, but the propositions are so insane. I mean, in general, under Blair and so on, we've seen the massive expansion of laws on the books. There was a new law for every day, pretty much, Tony Blair was in office. So legalism and lawfare are just expanding constantly. And I think alongside that, I've just been reading about the Stasi and GDR tactics around Zersetzung, which was a kind of a decomposition technique to sort of psychologically destroy individuals. And that was really done using volunteers. So we also have a kind of two-tier, if you like, of the state and people who are acting in the state's name. They may not be being directly paid by the state, but they're basically operating as vigilante kind of neo-Stasi officers, gathering screenshots, reporting people, calling them names, sort of reputation damage, all of these things which are designed to basically shut people up, confuse them, make them afraid, and to stop them from talking to each other as well. I mean, I'm involved in various community organising things, art events, and people try to close them down. People want to stop people meeting, even for the most gentle cultural events.
That was one of the cruel paradoxes of Soviet tactics behind the Iron Curtain, of course, was that there was this pretense that we were building a greater community, a greater collective, in which the reigning principle would be one of solidarity. But of course, given that needed to be enforced in a top-down fashion, it was necessary to make individuals feel incredibly atomized and isolated so that they didn't have those support networks.
Yeah, you have some experience in these sort of, I don't just want to call your time there renter mobs, but certainly the people that go with stand up to racism placards that still have Black Lives Matter on them from 2020. Yeah. There's certainly a level of astroturfing there.
Yeah.
I think there's two tiers even within this organisation. You're right. You've got the Nick Lowellses and the Hope Not Hates, who are provably funded by the tune of hundreds of thousands by the Paul Hanlon Foundation or the Home Office that benefit from charitable status, that are attack dogs of the state that get to insult me, dox friends of mine like Raw Egg Nationalist, and smear sitting MPs as essentially members of Patriotic Alternative or something like that. And then you've got the street level agitators who will come out on a Wednesday afternoon, pick up these placards, even if they aren't being directly paid, because there's some sort of social reinforcement mechanism or there's some kind of social currency being paid there. Do you have any insight as to why those people will just come out of their own volition on a Wednesday afternoon?
I mean, I was never a member of the Socialist Workers' Party, but I was friends with people who were in the party. It's very much like a cult. I mean, they're very organised. They have extremely good organisers, I have to say. Unlike most of the left, who are individually quite flaky and not very reliable or responsible or nice or moral or anything, actually. But the SWP actually trains people. It has kind of cadres. It has kind of a leadership hierarchy structure. They have like group meetings often. There's a kind of cult-like thing. They have their own drug dealers. They have their own parties. It's a very much kind of you're integrated into the group. And so they can mobilise people quite quickly. I think what's also happening, though, is precisely as you say, NGOs, people who've gone after me are working for NGOs. One of my great persecutors, who's seemingly doing it for free, although I'm never quite sure, works for the Cherie Blair Foundation.
Oh, lovely.
And I did point out that she works for the wife of a war criminal, but, for some reason she's the moral one and I'm the evil one. But, yes, we've got tons of these foundations, NGOs, people with tons of money. They can mobilize people really quickly. And it's easy to do so, especially if you're playing off this idea that people need to be good, right? There's this threat. There's this far-right, thuggish threat. Thug comes from this Indian word for people who lynch you in the street, by the way, criminals. It's a very, very violent word to use, actually. They're doing it deliberately. They know what they're saying. So they can mobilize people's good nature, So a lot of people are being played horribly. They were played just as they were played on the gender stuff. Nobody wants to be hated. It's not very nice to have people mobbing you and calling you names and hating you and spreading rumors. It's really unpleasant. Very few people would ever want to have that happen to them. So if they do it to a few people, again, they can create this kind of fear. I don't want that to be me. I want to be a good person. Okay, we're going out and fighting the fascists. The fascists are, millions of them. Of course, the far right in that sense doesn't really exist. And that there seems to be no space to simply say, look, there are people who are genuinely upset, emotionally, feel emotionally terrible about what's happened, all of these violent incidents. They're concerned about immigration. They're concerned about where they live. They're concerned about their families and their communities and having meaningful work and all of these things that makes a human life. And that is being depicted as only far right. I mean, this is insane, right? That there aren't enough Nazis as well. This is the thing. They have to keep creating them. Like, I'm a Nazi, gender critical women are Nazis.
And they create them by inflating the language, of course.
Right. Yes. So, everything's a genocide. Everyone's a Nazi. I mean, this is kind of, it's deranging. I mean, it's designed to be deranging,
Yes. We should get into, I suppose, the details of your case then. So for people who aren't aware of what's gone on, what happened to you? And do you blame the law itself or malicious interpretations of the law?
So it's quite hard to explain, but I was on the left, the old left, the left I like to romanticize as being open-minded and kind-hearted and forgiving and sort of post-Christian, but, maybe that's a kind of fantasy as well. But I would say in the 90s, the left, at least culturally, was committed to free expression, transgression. The idea was that censorship was coming from the right and that kind of thing. I mean, I think we had a delusional idea of the Christian right as well, which was hardly big in the UK, but for some reason we had this fancy image of the US Christian. Anyway.
But Louis Theroux documentaries, you go and visit. I imagine that must have fed into the paranoia bit. You go and visit the Westboro Baptist Church, and you guys would all get very anxious, I suspect.
Right. I mean, it doesn't make any sense now. But and then the kind of New Atheist Project, and it was this idea of, well, we can use reason. I mean, I don't think the rationalist movement now in general is particularly engaging in a great deal of reason use or the defence of dialogue or disagreement or anything either. But
anyway, I interrupt you. Sorry. So that was your background.
Yes. Sorry.
Yes.
Okay. How do I explain this really quickly? Somebody started defaming a lot of people, accusing them of being anti-Semitic and fascist and so on, and also making kind of factually untrue claims that there were kind of police investigations into death threats and claiming that people had written articles about Hitler when they hadn't. I mean, really crazy stuff. We wrote some letters saying this is defamatory. Can you take this down? This person then called Luke Turner, who's an artist who works with Shia LaBeouf, the Hollywood actor. Oh. So he's very rich. He has access to millions of pounds, as we discovered, because he spent 1.3 million pounds and is now spending more money buying my bankruptcy off the state, because you can do that apparently. And then you can pay forensic people to go through your accounts, even though I haven't got any money. And he knows that he's just sort of being, whatever, sadistic. Rich people can be like this. I guess some rich people, and not all rich people.
You're reverting back to your Socialist Workers' Party days there a little bit.
I was never a member. But okay, to cut a long story short, he counter-filed for harassment. He wouldn't have any engagement with us, so we couldn't come to any settlement before the trial, which we tried to. We tried to say, look, okay, let's drop hands, walk away. Like we never speak to each other again. We never, that would have been wonderful, marvelous. Just delete the stuff. We'll never talk to you again. We wrote like a couple of things. I said, you're paranoid, you're a liar, you feel guilty about your inherited wealth, or something like this. This he claimed was anti-Semitic because I mentioned wealth, and the idea is some trope. Even though, of course, like not all Jewish people are rich, and lots of rich people aren't Jewish, and poor people are Jewish, and whatever, it doesn't matter.
Noted billionaire Eric Kaufman has been on the show before. It's just absurd.
I think they call that a category mistake. But
anyway, but it's so deliberate. So he was calling everybody an anti-Semite for basically anything. And so he counter-filed for harassment. We didn't accept that because we said we haven't harassed you. We're not going to agree to this because otherwise we'd have still been bankrupt because he employed Mishka and Dereya, who are a very expensive law firm. He spent all this millions of pounds, so he would have been bankrupt anyway, even if we'd accepted his terms. So we went to trial. We lost our case on serious harm grounds, not because he hadn't lied about us, because he had. So it was me and another guy called Daniel Miller, who's also a writer. He's literary editor of IM 1776, very good magazine. Probably some of your viewers might be interested in magazine. Very good, kind of in a distant right sort of arena. But how to put it? So we lost on serious harm grounds, but not on the truth grounds, because Luke Turner admitted in court that he'd lied about the Hitler article. And we had the police witness come in and say, yes, there was no police investigation. Luke had reported Daniel to the police on the basis of some mean tweets, but the police hadn't carried out an investigation. So there was no investigation into death threats. And certainly it had been over, the whole thing had been closed, and Luke was continuing to claim that Daniel had threatened him with death, which is a criminal, that's a lie. That's a lie. There is a difference between fact and opinion. And we should hold on to that, by the way. This is not actually a matter of free speech in the sense of people being allowed to say various things, but defamation is a very specifically different thing, which is making factually untrue claims to smear people.
It's calculated destruction of a person's character.
Reputation destruction, like Zerzetson, like all of these regimes do. Luke was doing it to loads and loads of people. We couldn't bring a group case, unfortunately. You have to do it in your own name. But he lost his harassment claim against us because we hadn't harassed him.
Yes.
So it was good that we did this. Unfortunately, I think the judge didn't really understand the internet. I'm not sure anybody understands the internet, but she didn't seem to understand it particularly well. And I don't think she understood exactly this kind of tactic that he was using as somebody who he claims that he's an anti-fascist researcher, and that somehow he's doing this for the protection of others and the good. He claims to be motivated by this deep political sentiment. I think that's not his motivation. I think his motivation is psychological and financial, because it's only very rich people who can afford to do this. Otherwise, we would have had a discussion and said, look, what you said isn't true. Can you take it down? We promise never to have any interaction with you whatsoever. We barely had any in the first place. We deleted it immediately because it was obviously going nowhere. And that would have been an end to it. But he got so into it, he produced 26 ring binders of evidence, quote unquote, against us, including photographs of my necklaces, which was unbelievably creepy.
Trying to make allegations of some kind of sort of Nazi symbolism, or was that neo-fascist?
It didn't even make any sense. It was like, I think this necklace is a cultist. And it's like, well, are you accusing me of being a Satanist? I mean, I go to church, okay.
Yeah.
It's all this kind of weird projection, guilt by association. And then it was, you had a Twitter interaction back in 2018 with someone that I've decided is a neo-Nazi. This person is not a neo-Nazi. Mm-hmm. It's somebody that Luke disagrees with.
And firstly, just to clarify, so this was being litigated in the UK or in the US?
In the UK, so in the High Court.
In the High Court here, but he's an American?
No.
Oh, okay. No, I didn't know. I don't know why I had that idea.
No.
What do you think the main lessons are from that case, for want of a better word, for our side generally on navigating these various legal tripwires that exist?
I think we have to say that the law is not our friend, and that the judiciary is probably pretty captured at this point. And I don't recommend it psychologically, financially, morally. I think a larger question, and I to be clear, I'm not suggesting that this is what we should have done, but it's very clear that a culture that deals with everything through law and not through, let's say, personal interaction and, taking it up with somebody, it makes it very difficult to resolve things. In other communities, things would be done differently. And I'm not defending the use of violence or anything like that, but I'm saying there's a more personal way of perhaps dealing with when people are kind of going crazy and they're trying to ruin you and they're trying to destroy you. And it's very obvious that that's what they're doing. They're being a bully, they're being antisocial, they're being disruptive of any kind of social fabric. And what do we do about people like this? It's actually a problem. We live in a very pathocratic world now, where people with personality disorders and pathological behaviour are being rewarded for them. The victim culture. It's like if you say you're a victim, he constantly says he's a victim. It's like, well, these people are actually in charge now, and these are very scary people. They're bullies.
This is what Chris Rufo likes to call a cluster B society,
Yeah.
of where even if you do not have the traits of a narcissist or a game player or a psychopath, you are incentivized to adopt those traits just to try and get ahead. And I do think what you're speaking to is the loss of a kind of negotiated communal social texture versus the social contract conception of society, which is you live up unto the letter of the law. And in those societies, the people who are the least likely to respect the law, which are the sort of dark triad types that Jordan Peterson frequently likes to talk about these days, is going to do everything in their power to circumvent the law and use all the wealth at their disposal, use all of their cunning and the time on their hands to comb through every artifact of your life, which is now permanently legislated on a tablet online. And genuine and sincere people, and look, I've known you for like a year. You're lovely.
Longer.
Yeah, it's been about August that I interviewed you on Lotus Eaters. When I spoke to you at ARC a couple of days before the verdict came in, you were really upset about this, and I could see it. And it's because you here wanted to enact an earnest effort to ensure that false accusations of racism, anti-Semitism, and the like are corrected.
Yeah.
And at the moment, the problem is with these NGOs like Hope Not Hate or with this chap, there's not a method of recourse for that at the moment, not communal or legal.
No, and I think that's right. And often people who are very rich and they can employ very sort of clever, I don't want to say clever, cunning, more like lawyers who can do everything just about within the law, right? So he's carried on his campaign. You know, he leaked private chats which were not online that we disclosed in the case to prove that we weren't harassing him because we don't talk about him. But he leaked extracts from them where I say at some point we should read Mein Kampf to understand it. And at one point I make a joke in response to some sort of piece of woke text or whatever. I say, oh, this is awful. Like, oh, I'm definitely a Nazi now. Lol. Right?
Yeah.
And he's taken these out of context to say, this is a confession. This witch has confessed. She's a witch. Look.
It's clear to any fair-minded person who combs through those transcripts that those are jokes. And goodness me, who hasn't in an unguarded moment made, choice remarks among friends because they're trying to make people laugh. Like, it's just something that that all of us do. But it becomes a problem when the law and again the people who are either circumventing the law or the people who are infiltrating the law are when the law is increasingly humorless. These sorts of jokes and memes, even if circulated privately by the according to the ideological priors of the regime, these are sort of intolerable pollutants. even whether it's a full-on hate crime or a joke in a private group chat, they're both sort of on the same spectrum of socially polluting of the social order, and therefore there needs to be a curative, corrective. All of a sudden, the law needs to adopt a sort of curative and corrective function in terms of purifying the society of precisely those kinds of pathologies, because left-wing activism these days has a fundamentally utopian cast of mind to it, and utopians are nothing if they are not sort of quixotic pursuers after purity.
Yeah, although I have to say there's something very paradoxical, let's say, about the fact that these chats were not online. I mean, he's put them online. So if my words are so horrible and offensive and violent and evil, he's the one spreading them. They're not online. Like, he leaked them. They didn't exist anywhere.
It is paradoxical, but for these people, as you know, these pathologies, whether it's racism, whether it's racist jokes or actual racist thoughts, bigotry against this accredited victim group, bigotry against that accredited victim group.
Very selective anti-Semitism.
Very selective anti-Semitism. Yeah, the rules there are increasingly changing. These are so woven into the cultural DNA of our society that there can't be any sort of half measures. There needs to be a complete extirpation of every single trace of anything that can lead to the sort of horrors that the left associate with these pathologies, and that is the nature of their utopianism, and therefore nothing can be left. No stone can be left unturned, including in private group chats.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree. I do feel like I've been under the microscope and people are looking for this little dark ant of horror that will prove that I'm really this evil person. And it's, I think we have a culture that doesn't understand evil anymore. We have this victimhood thing, like you say, anyone who invokes the victim narrative, and this is a problem of a post-Christian society, because actually if you're a Christian, right, nobody is a pure victim. Christ is a victim. You know what I mean? And we are all basically both perpetrators and victims. Nobody is a pure victim. And nobody is kind of can compete with Christ. And I think a lot of what's going on is people trying to put themselves in the place of Christ, and say, I'm the biggest victim. I'm the biggest victim. And of course the biggest victim would never be able to speak in that way. They wouldn't be able to use millions of pounds. They wouldn't be able to use courtrooms, you know? I mean, it's horrific. So we've got this kind of inverted culture where people who are the most powerful and the most violent and aggressive and punishing other people and bullying actually are using victimhood as this kind of perverse, grotesque mask.
Indeed, and because they are also fanatical believers in human perfectibility. And I mean, look, obviously, okay, so
Yeah.
you get two types of activists.
Some of them are cynical.
Yeah, that's the thing. So that's true. So you do get the Machiavellian dark triad types for whom the ideology is a mask and they're actually not very, but I do think you do get genuine true believers in the luxury belief class as well, who do subscribe to every jot and tittle of the creed, and for whom it is a kind of religious relationship to a set of creedal values as well. And those people, rather than the dark triad Machiavellian types, I think that they are genuinely fanatical believers in human perfectibility. And the problem with being a fanatical believer in human perfectibility is that there can be very little tolerance or very little acceptance or very little forgiveness for people who fail to perfect themselves.
Well, ultimately, you just have to kill the people who won't obey you.
As a
Yes.
Labour councillor at the time of recording,
Yeah.
yesterday on the Wednesday massive anti-racism riots, all peaceful, as all of the front pages say, he said we should slit the throats of these fascist Nazis, and he's been suspended from the Labour Party. At time of speaking, he hasn't been investigated by the Met yet. They said, we've seen this video, we understand there are concerns, so I'm sure two-tier policing will be put to rest in this regard. But on the human perfectibility point, I think this is something that ties into your trial, actually. This is what they mean by far right. This is what Keir Starmer means by far right. This is what the judge in your case, when she said the online right means neo-reactionary, dissident right, alt-right, and then all of these, as if me, Eric Kaufman, Pearl Davis, and Nick Fuentes all share a connective chain of thought.
Guilt by association.
Quite, yeah. Which is what
What about that group chat we're all in? Kind of?
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's absurd. What I think is they're trying to turn every single country, every landmass, every economic zone into an ideological project, like the conception of America. And so they've redefined British values, British identity as tolerance, liberal pluralism, secularism, capitalism. And all they have to do is take people from deprived areas, put them through the portals of Heathrow and Gatwick, shower them in British values, and they are part of the liberal project. And it's actually the people that complain about this, the people from those deprived areas that Douglas recently wrote about in his Spectator column, that in 2011 have had areas where unemployment was high, and now in 2024 the unemployment's even higher. Those are the ones that are rioting. They're not going to listen to their concerns. They're not going to say that they're an indigenous people with certain concerns and a tighter landmass. They're instead going to say ideologically far right. And so they are ideological dissenters from the ideological British project of liberal pluralism. And so we are at liberty to cast them away, even if this box of far right doesn't quite add up or make sense.
They're getting in the way of the utopian project, fundamentally. And in order to have that utopian project, you need to have that belief in human perfectibility and human malleability. Otherwise, you can't be a utopian. You just need to pursue the best possible regime rather than the best sort of idealistic regime, which is clearly their focus, or at least the focus of the non-cynical ones.
But then that means now, like in the far right, there are former lefties, sort of politically homeless like you, that's just interested in questions of secularism.
Well, yeah, or talking in general. I mean, I'm like, I'll speak to anyone. But that makes me a Nazi, right? Because it's like, oh, you can't speak to him, you can't speak to her. This
Famous for
person
talking to
doesn't.
anyone,
Right. I mean, that's what philosophers do, and Christians, actually. Like, we should all speak to each other and to understand where we're coming from. I mean, how else the left used to be, like, meet people where they are, give them a better explanation. If somebody comes to you and say, I'm angry about this group and I blame them for everything, you say, oh, okay, fair enough. But have you thought about capitalism and the flows of capital and how this might be impacting both of you? You know what I mean? Like, you give a better explanation. So with the hope that you would change someone's mind and give them a better story. You don't just say this person should be murdered because they have, like, intolerant beliefs. I mean...
While we've got you here, Nina, we probably should ask you about this topic, which might seem a bit shoehorned in at the end, but I think it's worth asking. So there's clearly except in France, there's a very pervasive and growing political gender gap that exists. And there's a theory among some on the right of politics, particularly the dissident right of politics, that the decline in fertility in women means that women's natural instincts towards bonding and caring and their natural risk aversion, and this is all sort of social psychology has established the fact that women generally trend more in that direction. Those aspects of the feminine nature don't disappear all of a sudden, but all of a sudden they have different objects of concern rather than those bonding instincts being marshaled in a very conservative way towards children, and risk aversion being marshaled in a very conservative way towards maintaining the civilizational structure that makes childbearing possible. And all of women voted to the left of men, to the right of men,
Absolutely.
before the 1960s.
Yep.
After the 1960s, the pill, decline in female fertility. All of a sudden, feminine sensibilities up for grabs, and they can be weaponized in very left-wing directions. So all of a sudden, the baby becomes the vulnerable migrant, and the risk aversion, which might have led to belief in conservative fiscal policies and maintaining order, are directed towards the enforcement of certain speech codes. How much do you go along with that theory that femininity is being weaponized in an age of low fertility?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fertility question is a kind of scientific one, and it would also involve discussing drops in male fertility as well. And I think, we can talk about plastics in the water and estrogen and all of those things. And, it looks like, yes, but sure. I mean, there are two different kinds of sort of implicit and explicit infertility, right? So one of which would be taking the contraceptive pill, which tricks your body, but actually a lot of women have pulled back from that because they know it's very bad for you. It has very negative effects in many cases.
Definitely.
So, I mean, I think it's complicated. The picture is complicated in the fertility front. I do think there are people making conscious effort really for a kind of pronatalism. Maybe that's kind of happening a bit more. I certainly meet people who are getting married younger again and thinking about it in a more structured way and having children younger, and I think that's very positive. I think it does seem to be a kind of global picture. However, it seems like the only demographic groups that have increase in fertility are very hyper-religious groups, so very Orthodox Jewish communities and some religious cults and so on. Whereas even in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world, there's a slowdown at the very least. So there's a lot going on there. I'm not qualified to talk about the global demographic situation. But I do think, yes, I think this desire to be good and to actually be good, not just to be seen as good, but to actually be compassionate and be kind has been hijacked. I think it's been absolutely manipulated. I think when I was on the left, I absolutely remember a kind of feeling, a desire of sort of pathological altruism, which is actually suicidal. It's very destructive. I mean, lots of people have burnout if you're an activist because you're sort of constantly, you don't even think about yourself. You sort of don't have a self. You're not, and I think this is one of the problems. It's like there's no, if everybody's fungible, we're just human biomass, right? So it doesn't matter where you come from. Like there's no ancestry, there's no background, you've got no tie to anywhere. Everyone is sort of de facto global and cosmopolitan, even though that can't possibly be true at any level, either at the level of sex. We can't change sex. There are huge differences in populations and backgrounds and cultures, all of which is sort of being ignored or pretend. We don't talk about that. That would make you an evil person to even notice these things. But yeah, I think we are being manipulated, and women are perhaps more manipulable in certain ways on this, also about social conformity. And the reason maybe that women used to be more conservative is actually a symptom of their desire to conform more than anything.
Yes.
I'm very interested in this growing political gap between young men and young women. I think it's hugely significant and not a good sign. I mean, you have places in like South Korea, which I think has the lowest birth rate, where you basically have groups of men and women living apart.
And South Korea also has the worst gender divide as well among countries in the world. I've just been given the signal that I have to wrap up, which is a real shame because I was enjoying this immensely. We must have you back again soon, Nina.
Well, I've got a lot of free time now.
Yeah, very good. And hopefully a renaissance in family formation might narrow that gender gap a little.
Well, if you do want to help with that renaissance family formation, read Nina's recent book. It's very good.
There we go. What's the title?
Oh, well, it's not that recent.
Well, it's a couple of years, but
it's called What Do Men Want? And it's actually a positive, it was in the wake of all of this attack on men, and I was trying to diagnose it and think about it and actually say, no, we're playful friends and companions and husbands and wives and fathers and sons, and it's good, and men and women should get along.
Well, let's hope you get some royalties from that plug. Connor Tomlinson, thank you for joining me as well on Deprogram. You've been watching Deprogram. Make sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment if you wish to do so, and we shall see you on the next one.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.